In a recent video, I explained how Christians judge God when they read the Bible. Now, if you're a Christian, I can imagine what your response might have been. There's a good chance you'll admit that you do react differently to Christ's teachings than to slavery, but that this isn't because you judge God's commands. Instead, you'll claim that you studied both of these teachings carefully within the context of the entire Bible, and you reject things like slavery as an obsolete part of God's old covenant with Israel, while you follow Jesus' commands because they still apply to us today. I'm guessing you'd say something along those lines because that's what I would have said as a Christian, so I'm making this video to follow up on that point. The first and most obvious problem with this idea is that Jesus never gives a clear and systematic refutation of the Old Testament. Sure, he mentions a few things, but he never digs into some of the more tricky issues Christians really want to rid themselves of. For example, slavery is never condemned anywhere in the Bible. Rape is never described as anything other than a property crime against a woman's father or husband. And not once does the New Testament explain, refute, or in any way contextualize the conquests and genocides conducted at God's command. I can see why Christians would want Jesus to address these things, and by doing so thoroughly explain away God's Old Testament behavior, but he doesn't. Whatever qualifications he makes to Old Testament teaching are haphazard and unclear, and at one point he actually says the entire law remains in effect. So it seems to me that Christians, not Christ, are the ones rejecting these teachings. Now, of course, I know that it would be very difficult to argue this point to its conclusion with a Christian. As vague as Jesus' message on the Old Testament was, we could spend all day picking over the minutiae of his various comments and going back and forth on whether they represent a loosely worded refutation of Jehovah's various atrocities and covenants. But I don't want to get into that kind of semantic hair-splitting with you. So let's back away from the debate over what Jesus taught and instead focus on the question of why you react to the Old Testament the way you do. To that end, I'm going to propose a little thought experiment. I want you to pretend that you just sustained a head injury that wiped out your memory of the Bible. You still have the same personality, the same sensibilities as before. You even consider yourself a follower of God, trusting Him and believing His word is true. You just don't remember what His teachings actually are. So a friend, seeing your predicament, hands you a copy of the Bible, and you open to the beginning and start reading straight through, just as you would with any other book. Now I want you to think very carefully about what your experience would be as you worked your way from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus and onward. Consider how your mind would process the various laws you would come across, the various stories of how God killed people or ordered the extermination of entire societies. Think of what He seemed to take offense at. Think of what He punished, what He rewarded, and why. Now remember, as you're in the thick of Hebrew law, or the books of Israel's history, this is all the Bible you've read. You're not aware Jesus ever existed, and you have no New Testament teachings by which to reinterpret or contextualize what you're reading. Thus, your entire image of God's character and priorities is being shaped by whatever books you've made it through so far. So halfway through the Old Testament, what would you think of it all? How would you relate to this God, His people, and His commands? Would you look positively, with no reservations, at the killing of the Egyptians' firstborn? At the slaughter of every man, woman, and child in Jericho? At the stoning of a man who picked up sticks on the Sabbath? Would you meticulously study laws about mixed fabrics, or shellfish, or making women marry their rapists? Would you freely apply all these stories and teachings to your life and let them inform how you act toward others, warming to the idea of theocratic executions and being totally comfortable with the idea that God may call upon you to kill some of your idolatrous neighbors? As you progress through the books of poetry and prophecy, would you continue to eagerly absorb new teachings about how vengeful and tribal God is, and how vengeful and tribal He wants you to be? And would these teachings stick with you through day after day of Bible reading, only to be challenged once you flip from Malachi to Matthew and discover a sudden change in the flavor of God's Word? Once this happened, would you find yourself, perhaps with some hesitation, coming to grips with the fact that all the teachings you had learned and clung to that point were being upended by this new character named Jesus? Would you find yourself shedding one layer after another of your Old Testament morality as the final pieces of God's Word fell into place before your eyes? Would this process only become final once you read enough to clarify that the Bible as you'd understood it was actually just an old covenant that didn't count anymore? Because that's what would happen if you approach the Bible the way you claim to. That's what would happen if you do not judge God's Word. You essentially say that the Bible and nothing else guides your life, meaning that you would only ever reject part of the Bible on the grounds that a later teaching within the same text supersedes it. Which means that if you started with a blank slate and read the Bible cover to cover, you would happily accept the Old Testament at face value until you discover that the New Testament reversed it. However, I honestly don't think this would happen. Instead, you would be shocked by every story of God-condoned genocide, every sexist or arbitrary or barbaric law you came upon. You would find what you were reading to be weird and morally repugnant, because you never needed Jesus' help to figure out that it was weird and repugnant to begin with. I'm positive that unless you're a really sick person, you would either stop reading the Bible out of sheer disgust, or, without a vague sense that the New Testament serves as a permission slip for rejecting 2/3 of God's Word, you would find some other way to tell yourself that what you were reading didn't really count. And why not? You do this with parts of the New Testament, right? You do not reject the Old Testament because the New Testament overturns it. You reject the Old Testament because your sense of morality tells you to. And a vague reading of the New Testament, with Jesus' few mixed indications that some of the law might not apply the way it had before, is your ticket to looking away from parts of the Bible that you, as a decent person with reasonable sensibilities, find offensive. You are a product of the modern world, and you adhere to and benefit from modern moral ideals. I know you find the Bible important, and you may have grown up being taught to revere it. But it's time to reflect on what's actually in the Bible and how it does and does not square with the moral values you find most important. The best way to do this is to read the book cover to cover, as I have multiple times. The results may surprise you.